Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we are going to discuss about outbound REST integrations in ServiceNow. To start with, if you want to establish a communication between two different applications, in currently we need a web services. And one of these two systems, one will act as a client and the act as a server. The client sends a request to the server through the REST messages, and the server processes it and returns the response to the client. In outbound REST messages, ServiceNow application acts as a client, and you will be trying to interact with a third-party application to get the information or to create a record in third-party application or to update a record in third-party application or to delete a record in third-party application. So if ServiceNow acts as a client and you're trying to get the information or trying to do some action external to the ServiceNow using the web services, this type of an integration in ServiceNow called outbound integrations. This type of integration is called, it's an outbound integrations. So in the outbound integrations, ServiceNow sends a request to the external server or the application, and the external application receives that request and it authenticates that request and sends the response back to the ServiceNow. At the ServiceNow, it will be receiving the status code and the response body. In the response body, we will read the required information from the response body, and we will be taking the action at the ServiceNow side of it. So as I said, in the outbound integrations, ServiceNow acts as a client, and there will be a third-party application which will be acting as a server. For example, you are trying to create a group in Azure system. So what's a client? ServiceNow, and it tries to create a record in Azure or a group in Azure. So that will be the external application, and that acts as a server. Okay. So here the sequence of steps wherein you initiate a request from ServiceNow and the server receives that request and process that request, returns back the status code and response body. At the client at the ServiceNow, you will try to read that information whether that operation is successful or fail. Then in ServiceNow, these third-party API details will be stored in REST messages. Will be stored in a REST messages. In the REST messages, you will be have a place to add an endpoint, and you also have to specify what type of authentication that you are going to use, and you also have to specify the methods which methods that you're trying to use to communicate to the external applications. So in ServiceNow or in web services, there are these main methods called get, post, put, patch, and delete. Each of method does a different job. Right now, in our example, we will be going to use a get method to get the information from the external application. Okay, let's go here. Look at the configuration of outbound REST messages. Why? Because in ServiceNow, if you want to interact with any other external application, that information will be stored somewhere in ServiceNow. That place is called outbound REST message definition. And later, once you define this, you will use this REST message to call from the server side script as well. So what will be the definition here? Let's go to the ServiceNow Studio, open REST messages. So you have a system web services as a main application module, and inside that you have an outbound module. Beneath that you have a REST messages. Click on it. It will give you all the REST messages that currently available in ServiceNow. Yeah. Let's create a new one for us. So as I said, in the configuration, you need to provide an endpoint here. This is an endpoint by which we are making a call to the external system. And you have to provide a name to this REST message, a unique name to the REST message, so that in later, if you want to call this REST message through the server-side script, you can be using that. And you will be having two tabs here, or two sections here. The first section is in authentication. We will be having the authentication of four types. One is there will be no authentication when the free APIs are available. We will be using no authentication. Then the basic authentication. The basic authentication requires you to pass the username and password to authenticate to the external system. And the next one is a OAuth 2.0. It is a protocol based authentication, and it will not require to share a password, but it requires to share a token or the access key to authenticate it. And we will be covering this advanced authentication in somewhere in next videos. Then the next one is use mutual authentication. This mutual authentication requires to authenticate both client and server, and we can use basic authentication to configure for this use mutual authentication as well. Then the next one we have is HTTP request. In the next section, it will be used to provide an additional information to the API call. For example, you want to pass a token to the API call, then you will be specifying this HTTP request. So in this case, we are going to use this IP info. This IP info application. So what it exactly does here is when you pass an IP address, it will return the details of those IP address. For example, this is my IP address, and the IP address and the city region, it returns this response back to us. So this is a geolocation of a particular IP address. Okay. And what is an endpoint that we have to use? This is an endpoint that we have to use, ipinfo.io. Right. Let's give a meaningful name to our REST message. And the REST message endpoint here is, as I said, this is an endpoint. Let's copy this and paste it here. And as of now, this wouldn't require, or this will not require any authentication type. Let's keep this as a no authentication type and let's save it. So right now we created a REST message. Then the next step here is we have to create a method for that. What we are expecting here is to get the data from this IP geolocation API. So for to get the data from an external application, the method that we have to use here is the get method. Let's click on new, and I give a meaningful name to this. Here is geolocation. Geolocation. So what will be the endpoint here? Let's go here. If you look at the documentation, what it expects us here is to have this information passed something like this. So IP info, HTTP dot colon IP info.io, that endpoint. and the IP address followed by JSON. Let's go here, copy this. So this should be a dynamic value. I would like to pass the IP address as a dynamic value. So to send any variable to our endpoint, we have to use the variables like this. Let's say IP address and save this. And as I said, you can also configure the authentication on the HTTP method as well. And you can also inherit this from the REST message as well. So, but right now we don't need to have any authentication type. Let's keep it as it is. Let's keep as it is. So this is a variable. We have to pass the value to it. So let's click on the auto generated variable. So based on the variable that it has in the endpoint, it creates this variable substitutions, and you can pass the value to this variable. So the IP address of mine is this. Let me go ahead and add this value here. So this is my HTTP method. This is my HTTP method. And if I would like to test this, do we have an option to test it? Yes. So let's go here, click on this test UI action here. Let's click on this test. Okay, there is something wrong here. The URI is not correct. Let's go back and see what the mistake that we made here. So in the geolocation, yes, we haven't appended HTTPS to the endpoint URL. So let's save this and click on test. So once you send the request to the server, it processes it and returns back to the status code and the response body. Status code and response body. What is the status? 200. That means successful. And the response that we have received here in the JSON format. The IP address, city, and region and country. And the location and the organization. Let's go here. I would like to send a different IP address. Let's go here, give this IP address. This is from Alabama, US. Let's go here, substitute the value to this and save it and test it right now. And click on test. Give it a second. Let's go here, test this method. See, right now for this IP address, the request that we passed to the IP info application with the IP address, it processes that and returns us the geolocation of that particular IP address. So in this session, we discussed about how we can define a REST message, outbound REST message, by creating a REST message. And also we created a method to actually call this endpoint and do some of the operation on the server from the ServiceNow. Thank you so much for watching.